You are listening to the Christian Ghetto Podcast. Episode 15, a discussion with Nate Fischer on the new Founding Manifesto. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be having another Christian Ghetto discussion. Today, we're joined by Nate Fischer, CEO of New Founding. And I also have the Black Horse and Ernst van Zyl, Conscious Caracal, joining us as well from South Africa. But we've gathered together to talk about Nate's recent manifesto that he put up at New Founding, to talk about the role that his company and the way he sees venture capital firms operating and the potential for them in both resisting the regime and also building something beyond our current political moment and what that might look like. So welcome, Nate. Welcome, Black Horse. Welcome, Ernst.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to assume, and I made a note. I'm on the Substack post. This is going to come out with eventually that a link to the new Founding Manifesto, and also a link to an interview you did on the Jay Burden podcast, which I thought was excellent as well too. So people can catch up to that. So if you want to see the whole thing, I'm going to assign you the homework. Go do the reading and thing, and we're just going to jump into the discussion this morning. One of the things that you mention is, that we're looking at a situation of turmoil and peril. And you didn't sketch that out a lot in the manifesto, but maybe you could begin by fleshing out, sort of what do you see ahead of us in the near future, and what are the kind of challenges that you're looking at us facing that way?
So I'll sort of, I could speculate about more details, but I'll start high level by saying I don't have a strong view of what this will look like. It's almost more of a base rate assumption. So one way to look at it is when we've had major changes in the dominant medium of communications, we've had regime level change in society. You had when you had the printing press, excuse me, when you had the printing press emerge, you saw a change from a medieval structure of society to a very different structure of society. One, you had the Protestant Reformation, you had a society built around nation states, Westphalian order eventually. Likewise, when you had the telegraph and telephone and then TV and radio over about a century, you had a move from a era of nation states to one that was much more American Empire dominated. In between those, you had the 30 Years' War. You had World War I and World War II. You had any number of other changes. So I think, in many ways, I would say the base rate should be, when we have a change as consequential as the digital revolution, that there will be profound and often very violent changes. But I don't know if it's easy to say exactly what those will look like or exactly what the mechanism will look like. I could speculate about those, but I think it's more like I think we should just assume that such violence is likely.
I mean, it's sort of interesting because you can kind of read the manifesto two ways. You can read the manifesto as a discussion of the late imperial moment and the inevitable disruptions that come with the late imperial moment, or you can read the manifesto as a discussion of like a society undergoing technological disruption and the inevitable disruptions that accompany that. I think both themes are kind of there in the manifesto, and I assume that's intentional, Nate. Is that correct?
It is. I mean, I think I think you can see late stage stagnant empires continue a long time if they don't have a sufficient disruptor. So The combination is what's particularly potent. You have the conditions of a decadent, stagnant, late stage empire, and you have a technological revolution that's going to provide immense challenges to it. I would say if it weren't for the technological revolution, then it's less clear. I mean, you have people like Aaron Wren, a colleague of mine, who tends to have a much stronger, he's far more inclined to think that the regime is very strong and there's no reason to expect the regime will be challenged, even as it is clearly corrupt and decadent. And I think he's probably taking a lower view of the likelihood that external changes will be as disruptive. And then I think you could imagine a very strong regime is going to be potentially better adapted to adjust to technological change. That would be less clear. But I think that combination is really what I think gives me a high confidence in this thesis.
Well, one of the things, and I think this is in the notes that I passed you, one of the things that intrigued me was your observation that typically people have looked at it in one of two ways, that you work within the system to try to change it from within. So you send your people out, you try to seize the institutions, work from the system from within. Or the other option is to go into retreat and build isolated communities, sort of the Mennonite model. And you say that neither really, in your mind, seems like the path forward. And you talk about developing a third way, which is developing a power structures that can resist the regime. And how do you see technology building a sense of building sort of parallel institutions that can resist the regime, that aren't necessarily trying to transform it, but also aren't really trying to retreat as well?
So I want to emphasize one point there, which is technology is a pervasive theme in this, but I don't think that technology needs to be a centerpiece of every one of every one of the efforts I refer to here. Is important. I see technology as a driver of the macro themes, and certainly a major domain in the world that we'll be living in. In many cases, what will actually best resist the regime will be something that is less integrated with technology or with the technological system. So what we're doing in Appalachia is actually bringing people together in a physical community where technology will play a role. So that's a caveat to say this is as tech-centric as I think. You look at, say, Balaji's network state concept, and it's a sort of everything about it is deeply tech-centric. Everything's on the chain or whatever. But with that said,
I think the actual question here is focused on the model of exit to disrupt, right? So he laid out model number one, which is completely exit, the kind of the Mennonite model. Model number two is work within the system, reform the system. You've lifted this model, very clearly out of VC lingo, exit to disrupt. So exit with the intention of re-entering the system. Do you want to describe why you think that's a good solution? Why you think it's a better solution than either of the other two?
So yes. So fundamentally, and there's a book which I have not read, but I'm familiar with some of the options: exit, voice, and loyalty, that shapes some of this. And obviously, the loyalty option is you're loyal to the institutions, you're trying to preserve things. Voice would be you try to exercise voice within the institution rather than exit. The case I make against voice is fundamentally it's often playing in domains where the rules are stacked against us. So you try to rise, just as one example, you try to rise in government, and the current governmental structure is heavily bureaucratic. In many ways, I would say the triumph of the left was not that they got leftists into bureaucracies. The triumph of the left, the triumph of the progressive movement was that they got bureaucracy to be a dominant, the dominant form of institution in all sorts of domains. So once once the Presbyterian Church adopted a larger bureaucracy as a larger component of it, it's inevitable that it drifts to the left. Once we increase the size of the administrative state, it's inevitable that government drifts to the left. Once universities increase the size of their administration, it's inevitable they drift to the left. So what I would say is what that means is playing in that game means you're playing in a system that is fundamentally structured to favor certain outcomes, which I think is it's often going to produce a poor return on investment. And beyond that, it's often going to just be unpleasant. This was a point I made yesterday in the space. It's not fun. I don't think any of us would enjoy the life of a bureaucrat. I think bugmen, leftists, they do enjoy the life of a bureaucrat. Many of their
yeah, it's very true.
Whether they enjoy it or not, it's what they do.
It's very true. It's very suitable to them, and it's very unsuitable to people,
like us.
People
so
like
fundamentally, like if the call is we need 10,000 of our people to devote the next 40 years of their lives to trying to work their way up like Fauci in this system, that's like if we need to do it, we need to do that. There's people in there's classic sort of efforts of working your way up. But if that's the call to our movement, that's just unpleasant. I don't think people enjoy that. So, and second of all, even in there, the structure is not designed to allow the sort of change that we would want. So it's sort of it's an expectation of return combined with just, is it suitable to, generally, I think things that have impact often are going to be things that at least feel like you were meant to be doing that. And so the point about exit is when we have the opportunity for exit, and I think that this is where technology creates an opportunity. It's not that exit is always the right move, but we're in a moment where many of these institutions, in addition to there being a low return to trying to move them, there's arguably a low return even if we capture them. If they're sinking ships, if they are themselves subject to significant disruption, then even the prize is going to be lower. Okay. You're fighting over table scraps, and that's just, it's an unnecessary strategy. And it's sort of, we have this extraordinary, what excites me about this is we're in a moment where we have the opportunity to do something that is both more enjoyable and, I believe, higher impact. Okay. If we essentially play with the tools and play in the domain that is going to be reshaping the world, or perhaps focus less on the technology, but focus on building some of the good things that we do best, consciously doing so in a way that we know is going to be robust to those changes. So I'll give sort of two distinct examples. Either you go to the forefront of disruptive technology, you try to build an alternative platform of some sort that captures space in the digital domain, whether, let's say it's a Bitcoin related tool, just as one example. And I haven't gone heavily into that space, but it would be one clearly disruptive technology to the legacy regime. That is embracing a lever that could accelerate the disruption of the system. The other option is to recognize that in a world where trust in institutions collapses, the sort of community we have right here, you talked about, we get to know each other in whether it's private group chats, whether it be your own Christian, your church community, finding ways to double down on those to increase the scope of activities that are being done in that community, increase the sort of richness and depth of those offline communities, of those really human communities, is building something that will be potentially far, far more valuable in a world where the substitutes that have actually largely crowded that out in the managerial era fall apart. So in a world where you can't trust any of the search engines, just as an example, or let's say if you can't trust the credentials of elite law schools, if you can't trust the fact that someone's at a brand name law firm as meaning they're competent. DEI has corrupted that, or politics has corrupted that. They might not be loyal to you. One of the first places you'll naturally turn is to someone whose judgment you trust in your church community or in another high trust community. So by building a rich community there, we're building something that's robust to this disruption. So the point is, you can approach this in a way that's leaning into the technology, or you can approach this in a way that you're sort of predicting what the technology will and will not destroy, and what will be valuable. And Taleb, who's certainly influenced me a significant amount, talks about the Lindy principle. If you predict the future by looking back, and something that has existed for a long time is likely to continue to exist even after things change. So how do you predict what is going to survive technological disruption? And those sorts of high trust communities as mediators of activities in life is a timeless dynamic. Sort of large depersonalized bureaucratic institutions as primary mediators of many aspects of our life. Much more recent phenomenon, much easier to predict will be swept away without even knowing the mechanism.
Right, but so you've made an excellent case, and I think both the audience and this panel is going to be very sympathetic to the case that the reformist approach, work within the existing institutions, is maybe a mistake, and you've made an excellent case for exit. But the strategy you lay out in your manifesto is not exit; it's exit to disrupt, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at Ernst's project in South Africa, I don't think it's the project of the Afrikaners to eventually, by their example, recapture the South African government apparatus, right? It's not exit to disrupt; it's exit to exit.
It's an exit to manifest. It's an exit to create something new rather than to recapture something old.
Right. It's an exit to exit. I think the idea is a permanent Afrikaans community, right? The Mennonite community is not looking to eventually reintegrate with the broad culture, but the manifesto you've laid out here is an exit to disrupt strategy, which indicates an intention of some future moment where the institutions that you've produced are just so attractive that they become mainstream institutions rather than exit institutions. Do you want to talk a little bit about that vision of the future?
Sure. And I guess what I'll emphasize is there's sort of two facets to this. One is simply the degree of ambition, the degree to which we strive for excellence. I think one of the major problems with many exit to exit strategies, exit to parallel strategies, is they involve a degree of settling for something that is second tier or third tier. And perhaps even more than exit to disrupt, I would say exit to excel is actually a centerpiece. We need to build something that is great. We need to build something that is that is aspirational. Whether that ends up taking over anything comparable to the scale of the American empire or even the American nation is uncertain. And I would say it's not necessarily our actions today are not necessarily totally different if we exit to build something that can excel and be robust to disruption, even if it's 3 or 4 generations that are largely a sort of smaller parallel endeavor, more like what Ernst is doing, versus and maybe it takes longer for the existing institution.
Right. So what you're saying is disrupt and reintegrate. That's down the road. Right now is exit, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Is that right?
I would say there's an element of that. I would also say, and I this is interesting. I notice I'm the only. I think I'm the only American on this call.
Yes.
I think that
You are.
I think that there's something in the American psyche that wants to be called to that larger vision, to that element of we're not just look. The Puritans came over here to build a city on a hill, to build something that they saw as having a much broader impact. And I think that a call that has at least a plausible path to civilizational leadership is going to inspire people and is going to resonate in a way that a more Mennonite approach would not. Now, I think prudence dictates that we don't just swing for the fences on everything we do. Prudence dictates that many of the actions we take might actually look a little bit more like the Mennonite one, but it's there's almost an element of at least keep our eye on how we can. Well, and I would say very practically what this looks like is at the very least keep our eye out for opportunities for that sort of disruptive impact.
Right. So what I'm hearing is you want to emphasize the difference between what New Founding is trying to do and like the 1990s Christian music scene, where it's like the worst version, but separated of what is sort of out there in the broad culture. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say that would be one, and I would say probably the Mennonites would be another. They would actually be they've done a better job in some sense at an exit that's a sort of durable exit. But I would say the difference would be we at least have an eye to the Mennonites have often produced excellence, but with a mindset I think of more permanent exit. For us, it would be at least have one eye on, is there an option to take a swing to sort of recapture things? And part of that is just my belief that we are inheritors of this civilizational tradition, of this civilizational heritage. If we've inherited this, if we are in a position to recapture it, we should try to recapture it. It's not it's not that we should engage in something foolish for the sake of sort of recklessly trying to do so, but given the opportunity, it is a good thing for us to go for something much bigger in potential impact. Even as there may be things that would look like tactical retreats as part of that.
Yeah.
Okay. And that at least means a call to excellence. It at least means a call to excellence, but if possible, it means that swing for scale as well.
I had a couple thoughts. One is that the Mennonites, and this is a thing I think that a lot of people in discussing sort of the Mennonite option that way, is they forget that the Mennonites are able to do what they do because they live at the sufferance of the American Empire. So that if they ever became, because of the nonviolent nature of them, nobody really thinks of them as a threat. But if they ever became a threat, they would get squashed in that sense. And so there's this piece of, defending yourself and protecting yourself. And the other thought I had too is that, especially between like where Ernst is and where we are, that Ernst is already experiencing, like, the disruption of the state has already happened because of its own internal collapse. And they're, in a sense, grappling with the fallout of that. And some of the technology things that I've seen people trying to propose, one that popped up onto my feed was, people trying to come up with ways to, say, generate power and electricity on the scale of a small town of 10,000 people like Orania. And so there seems to be a sense of, one of the things that technology does, it allows you to build businesses at scale. It allows you to govern people at scale. And once you begin to disrupt that, your ability to govern at scale begins to erode. As you see in South Africa, it's being disrupted, with DEI type of policies. And we're seeing that in North America. So part of this whole, as we disrupt and we look to different models of leadership, there's this sense of that we're not going to be able to govern at scale, but yet we're facing the problem that one of the things that makes the American empire what it is that they're able to harness economic and military might at scale to project it not only locally within the North American continent, but also globally. And that's one of those challenges that you face, that as you disrupt and as you set up alternate communities, and if they're successful, unlike the Mennonites, do your communities become a threat then? there's this whole nested set of problems in both disruption and then also in sustaining sort of a third way with communities that way. I guess I don't know if it's really a question in there, but just more of a comment and observation as I'm listening to you talk.
Well, I'll jump in and I'll add. I think one of the key theses, and this is shaped a lot of the thinking, is the sovereign individual's thesis about the nature of sovereignty as a consequence of technology. So, in sum, the thesis is that the shape of sovereignty is determined by, to some extent, the tools that the units that wage violence and also the returns to violence. So in the feudal age, for instance, the fundamental unit of violence was the knight, and the returns to violence in an agricultural society were relatively high. If you control land, then you're able to extract reasonable rents from productive land. And so, but the knight's a small unit, so it naturally leads to a feudal system where a castle can support a few knights and they can control some land and they can extract the resources needed to do that. When you had a transition to the industrial age, the most competitive form of violence shifted to much larger armies. You need mass conscription. You need an industrial society capable of producing armored equipment. You need an entirely different economy. At the same time, there were still high returns to waging violence, as in if you control, let's say, the Rhine-Ruhr region in Germany, you're able to extract substantial rents from the high fixed assets that are there. But the fundamental prediction is the digital age will have a shift to a world where there will be very little ability to extract, there will be very little returns to violence. A large share of productivity becomes knowledge workers, and knowledge workers are highly mobile. So if you conquer Canada, and if the Chinese conquer and they try to force you to work productively for them, you'll just leave, and they're not going to be able to extract a very large share of your productive output. So there's now a low return to that, which suggests that you won't be able to have the resource extraction needed to support large centralized states the same way, and they'll inevitably starve in ways that will allow an emergence of something that look much more like city-states. And their thesis is very much city-states that treat knowledge workers as customers in a sense. I think that they may be a little too individualistic and libertarian in how they look at some of that. People still behave as tribes, but I think that the fundamental point that I'm not confident that there will remain the same means of funding an empire like the U.S. empire is actually a pretty central thesis to this. And I think we're already seeing.
Well, I think like if you look globally, you have governments starving for resources everywhere. And if you look at the quality of the work that they did 50 and 70 years ago versus the quality of work they do today, you can see that problem.
Well, and the fact that your global supply chain is predicated on the American ability to maintain peaceful sea lanes with the projection of naval power. Yeah. I was just going to say, Ernst, if you had any thoughts or questions maybe to throw into Nate, because you've been listening and catching up here.
Right. So I think something that stands out to me is, Nate, I really like the fact in your manifesto that you made the point that one of the challenges of our age or of our time is that we're going to have to firstly get people organized, and then secondly, channel the energy that is out there to be harnessed into the right type of projects. And I think that immediately makes me think of that quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said that we only have one decision. Every generation only has one decision, and that's whether to take up the task of the time. And I think that's the question of what is the task of our time. And I think you capture it in your writing, is that the task of our time is to get our communities organized and to create alternative centers of power that can actually realistically challenge the powers that be, that are actually manifesting quite evil and perverse realities in our own communities. And unfortunately, I think to bring this conversation a bit more to a relevant example, or relevant in the sense of an ongoing example, if I think of the riots in Britain at the moment now, not to counter signal, I think if there's anger within the communities within Britain, they've been led down by their government and they have a right to be angry. But when the dust settles after these demonstrations, after these protests, and there's no organizations or centers of power where this energy has been channeled to, then it will have been, in very harsh words, have been a failure. Because you can't just have this flare up of energy, of people voicing their frustration, and then afterwards have nothing to show for it. Your government, we already know our governments are not going to be responsive to that type of action. So you have to start asking, how can the energy is there. The energy is very visibly there to be harnessed. It just has to be channeled into the right directions, where when the dust settles, there is actually something there left in its wake. And I think the big lesson from South Africa that I constantly remind my audience on my YouTube channel and on Twitter of is the fact that the whole idea of when things get, there's this myth out there that if things get bad enough, then people will wake up and then things will change. People will get in, slot into gear and start doing some real things. And that's just simply not true. Like, things just, the lesson from South Africa is how bad things can get without triggering a revolutionary turning point. Things get really, really bad, and people just little by little start normalizing it and really pretty much making excuses for what's going on around you. The lesson from South Africa is not that you should be wishing for a collapse or some type of calamity and that's going to get people to wake up. You should rather be building in anticipation for that collapse or for that calamity. I mean, that's the type of philosophy where AfriForum came to the forefront. I mean, the solidarity movement that AfriForum forms a part of was not created within the crisis that South Africa finds itself within right now. It was created within anticipation of the crisis that we find ourselves within right now. And I think that's the central lesson that I'd like to convey to our European and American listeners, is the fact that you should not be waiting for that collapse to start building. You should start building today in anticipation of what is to come, because it's not going to be easier tomorrow. You're going to have to start today. You can't just keep postponing. It's much better to start boarding up your windows and start preparing for the storm than actually doing that when the storm has already hit. Then it's almost impossible. The final thought there, I would say, is during the big lesson from South Africa as well is that during a crisis, it's very difficult to organize people. People in the communities need to be organized beforehand, before the crisis hits. And excuse for the very annoying Harida birds here in the background. A very iconic sound here from South Africa, but I hope it's not picking up on the microphone. But it's so that's the concluding thoughts. I would just leave it there, is that you should not be waiting for the storm, because that will somehow wake up people. You should start preparing now for what is to come, because trying to organize people during a crisis is near impossible. It's like trying to herd cats.
Well, and that's a point that Alul makes in Autopsy of a Revolution, is that the thing that separates a revolt from a revolution is the presence of a plan and the ability to take the grievances of the revolt and turn them into a set of institutions that then can survive the revolt. And so what you're seeing in England is there's no plan. There's just angry people in revolt. And that's what I think I found so exciting about what you're doing, Nate, is to say, you know what, guys, we need a plan. And somebody needs to put something down on paper, and let's get this process going.
So
absolutely.
I think if you've arrived at this piece, it's very likely that you agree with that already. So the discussion here of the manifesto is very much like, how do we manage it in different contexts? One of the things that I think is interesting about the contrast between AfriForum's actions and the manifesto Nate laid out, Nate very aggressively pursues this private sector model, and it doesn't denigrate people trying to pursue local government as a nexus for a nexus for organizing, but definitely privileges the VC model, the private sector model. Nate, do you want to talk a little bit about why you think that's the right approach for the American context?
Yes. So and really, I think local is a significant pillar of this, but to some extent, I wrote this in reaction to I've known a few people who have tried to go into government, very good, very capable people in state politics, and even in a place like Texas, it does not remain a place where high capability is rewarded. It often here, being someone who plays by certain political rules of a political machine, even if it's a more right-aligned political machine, is what gets rewarded. So my fundamental thought is it's great to capture these local institutions. I think it's essential. I think that if we were to capture Texas A&M as an example and really be able to shape that as a vision of what a right-aligned university could look like, tremendous resources and power, not even a question. But the path to get there is not necessarily a path that talented, capable young people, it's not necessarily going to be a place where talent is rewarded and where the best people are going to rise, given the current rules of the system, even in a Republican state. And so given that, it may be better to build in initiatives that are outside. I'll give the evangelical world as another example. Evangelical institutions, many of them are just cesspools of mediocrity. We're talking about before that.
Yeah.
And they're that not because there aren't smart evangelicals. What we found with American Reformer, which is a nonprofit that I started around the same time as New Founding, there's a tremendous ecosystem of brilliant people who share these evangelical beliefs or other sort of Orthodox conservative Protestant beliefs, and just don't have a path in evangelical institutions, because it's not just that they happen to be mediocre. It's that they actually, all of the incentives and values of the systems reward a conformity and mediocrity. And so I think you often see the same dynamic in local politics, where it would be great theoretically to control a lot of those organizations, a lot of those institutions, but I'm not sure that that's the best place to direct effort. It may be better to rise outside, and then if it's strategically important, if it's an institution that can be replaced, replace it. If it's a strategically important one, as certainly red state government is essential, that then come from the outside, rise and capture it, which is obviously what Donald Trump did. Donald Trump did not rise through the Republican apparatus. Donald Trump built his profile in a very different space and then came in as a power player. And so that's it's certainly not I would say it's a prudential question rather than one that I see as if I were in South Africa, I think it would be in a space where physical safety is a much larger factor. I would think local government would be a much higher priority. And in addition to that, I think that in areas where you actually face significant physical threats, my sense is that people are much more receptive to. Now, I'm not as familiar. I'd be interested in specific dynamics, but my sense is local government is likely a very valuable path and a very attractive path for ambitious people in societies facing physical threats. And you look at El Salvador, and Bukele's job prior to being president of the country was actually mayor of the capital, and it's sort of natural that law and order people can rise. One point I was going to make that I think is going back to one of Ernst's points, though, that stood out is this point about it's very hard to organize people in a crisis. And this, I think, gets to actually one of the fundamental elements of maybe what an exit to what the disrupt component can look like. I think you can organize. I think that's absolutely true. But when you build the infrastructure of that organization, which must be done in advance of the crisis, I think that in certain cases, at least, you can build the infrastructure so that you can scale rapidly in a crisis. You look at Parler, and Parler, the app, had millions of people rush to join it immediately in the wake of the 2020 election, and they were not prepared for that scale. They didn't have the technological infrastructure for that scale, And then they certainly didn't have the infrastructure to resist the attacks by AWS, the deplatforming post January 6th. But theoretically, that platform could have been designed so that, in a sense, there was no time to build it in the crisis. But had they built it to scale, and had they had the sort of core of the community, the moderation in place, all of those things, really the sort of the people prepared to be civic leaders in a sense in the crisis, they might have been able to 10x in size or 100x in size during the crisis. Or I would say potentially build to design to scale in the aftermath of a crisis. So I think in the case of a financial crisis, and I'm using a financial crisis, a business example.
Like a business example of the financial crisis is my own business, which grew very, very rapidly as a result of 2008 because of where we were positioned in the market, right?
Absolutely.
And very similar to mine. Very similar to mine. And I would say I don't think people should categorize these. I even use private sector rather than business, because I think nonprofit and what I really mean is primarily outside of the system. Charles Haywood, I think, has done a good job talking about the dynamics of collapse of regimes and how they often parallel. There's sort of the collapse in trust in the Soviet Union is very, very similar to a financial crisis and a bank run and a delevering of other forms. So I don't think that I'll use the dynamics that I think we're all maybe more familiar with, like financial crisis. But if you have there's sort of two things, right? If you have a business that's solid, you can grow rapidly in the crisis immediately. If you have enough capital, that's often a little harder. So you think of Berkshire buying up businesses in an emergency situation as banks are failing. The second thing you can do is you can just sort of survive the crisis and come out of the crisis strong, but again, be in a position where you have the infrastructure to scale in the aftermath. And as people have sort of, as they have suffered from the collapse of leverage, they'll start to look to organizations that remain strong and recohere. So I think of church communities. Let's say we have a very strong church community where there's a high level of trust and a high number of capable people. Whether you're prepared to sort of scale up 100x in the crisis, it's going to be hard to necessarily, that's sort of an open question, but you now have something that when these other institutions have collapsed is now potentially a network that can provide tremendous value to a broader range of people. Let's say you open a business that does brokerage of some sort or otherwise sort of mediates high trust transactions, and you now have a network of 100 people who have deep relationships with each other, and you're prepared to sort of fairly quickly take over a lot of the functions of institutions that collapsed from a trust-based perspective. You've set yourself up to scale in the wake of the crisis. And so I think that you can build the institutions probably more the way the Menites do, where they're going to be robust to collapse, but they're not designed to scale particularly. Or you can build your organizations with an eye toward how can we scale during the crisis? How can we scale after the crisis? If we designed our infrastructure such that we know we have something that will be scarce and valued in the future. And that's really probably the most fundamental thing I'm looking for is even beyond intentionally trying to push the levers of disruptive technology, which I think we as a movement are just not. Look, we're not the kings of Silicon Valley. We are not the people who are likely best positioned to be wielding the levers of disruptive technology in many cases. But I believe that we are well positioned to recognize, to sometimes use that technology to build infrastructure that could scale. And I would say it's not even always technology. I think one key point is I mentioned religion as a coordinating mechanism. In a world where you have decentralization, possibly real challenges to any sort of centralized power, Christianity can provide a coordinating mechanism across any number of domains that might actually be impossible to be done by any centralized institution. So can we be prepared to provide the program, the model, as well as in some cases the institutions that can actually scale?
And this leads me to like a couple points. One is, in thinking about the AFRIFORM is there's a lot of people, like you say, Nate, in church communities, but also, in and outside of church communities who are thinking similar thoughts. The regime is losing its grip. There's troubles ahead. There's all these things. How do we prepare? How do we resist? How do we disrupt? But the moment isn't necessarily now, but how are we putting in place the networks that connect it? One of I was thinking, I was just reading or watching a video the other day about the ability of NATO to project power against if the Russians rolled the tanks across the border into Central and Western Europe, how quickly could the Americans respond? And then they had all of this infrastructure, the tanks, the armored personnel carriers were all just basically sitting there in various locations across Europe, kind of ready to go. Mm. And within, 2 weeks, you could basically have a full army on the ground, meeting that reform, and a significant portion of it within 48 hours. So these types of things. So I think getting our people thinking along that mentality of we can, we don't need it all right now, but how can we respond? And what are like, as you say, Nate, what are the kind of tools that we could put in place that would enable that quick response when the time comes? And then in the meantime, we're just going to get ready and go on with our lives, but build something. But then there's something that Black Horse and I have talked about is in terms of, how do you encourage your best and brightest to step away from the regime and to look at these exit and disrupt type of communities as sort of your ultimate startup, like
so if I'm
building a nation.
If I might draw a contrast, right? The reason why Ernst has no trouble drawing the most talented Afrikaners into his project is because you can either be an Afrikaner and be in that project, or you can not be an Afrikaner anymore, basically. Similar, Canada's, maybe a few notches down on that.
We're getting there fast.
We're getting there, but we're a few notches down. The United States, if you go to a talented 23-year-old, young man who comes from a white Christian community, there's still a lot of opportunity for him inside the institutions. What's the sell as to why you should attach yourself to the network, to a network like the one you're building, rather than deracinate yourself and go join the regime, right? What's the sell? How do you deliver that sell?
So that, I would say, that is part of the reason that we're focusing. Part of the reason I think a venture, and I use venture capital investment company, sort of a business focus is attractive, is I think that's an entrepreneurial project. I think in a world where you face threats to your personal safety, where your culture is being wiped out, where there's really not a great path, a more directly political approach is often viable. People, it's kind of like, come with us if you want to live. In a world where there appear to be more viable paths, you need to make it exciting. You need to make it profitable. I think there's an entrepreneurial problem. I think if we have a venture fund that is actually skilled at identifying talented entrepreneurs at the earliest stage, then our pitch can be, if you're a talented person, we might actually be positioned to fund you on an exciting project that you want to do before you would be able to get funding from other people. So that becomes an attractive sell. And this also goes back to the point of what is fun, right? People, you may be able to build a career at Goldman Sachs if you want to, and make a lot of money, but you might be dying a little bit inside every time you go to work, both from the lack of satisfaction of, ultimately the most talented people, if you're making $500,000 a year, $1 million a year, you have a lot of material comfort, but people in that position are often really consciously looking for more. They really want a level of agency and knowing that their work is accomplishing something, some subset of people at least. And
to add to that, Nathan, Nate, is the fact that when it comes to doing that type of job where, I mean, just take the organization that I work for, AfriForum. I could be making a lot more money in the private sector, but exactly as you described there, I would be losing a little bit of my soul every day that I drive to work. But when I work for an organization that's serving my community, serving something bigger than myself, I have no struggle getting out of bed in the morning, getting in my car, and I'm constantly thinking about work, and it's not a stressful thing. I'm lying in bed when I'm going to sleep. I'm sitting outside thinking about work. How can I make my organization and my community stronger, better, more resilient? And it's not a stressful exercise. It's actually an invigorating exercise. And I think I just wanted to add that to what you're describing there is absolutely a phenomenon that you can, it's a type of energy that you can tap into that I think is very attractive, especially to young men today.
Yes. And I would say knowing that it's efficacious is one of the most important things. So I would say you have to sort of tap into the spirit of the people. And that goes back to my earlier point about, I think for Americans in particular, there's a reason that the sort of path to a potential large scale impact is valuable. I think there's other cultures where that matters a lot less. But I think in America, that providing that path, providing that sort of at least potential impact it will inspire and excite people, combined with a very clear narrative for how what you're doing is efficacious. It's actually accomplishing something meaningful today, and it's accomplishing something that could be meaningful on a civilizational level. And those factors combine to really inspire people. And then I think finally, if we're very good at what we're doing, if we're very good at venture capital, if we're doing things with excellence, we may actually provide even financially competitive outcomes for people. I mean, if we're at the early stages of a movement that is actually growing, and if we're right, politics doesn't need to be a long-term sacrifice. The people who accompanied William the Conqueror to England
did very well. Yeah.
Yes. I think the idea that it's inherently, I think you should do it for something more, but it doesn't, if we are leading, if we're at the forefront of a movement that is actually going to be really planting the seeds of something great, it's appropriate that also be a long-term profitable endeavor, if not for us, at least for our kids and grandkids. And again, you look at who the sort of leaders of Israel when they settled the Promised Land ended up with great grants and all that. Many of the people who came to America early ended up being leaders of something. So certainly with that long-term time horizon, I believe we are planting the seeds of something that could have immense value in the future.
Right, and don't underestimate the power of giving someone, especially a young person, something to fight for, or helping to build something where every day or every year they actually see the fruits and the real life results of their work, of their labor, of what they're putting in. I think that's one of the key frustrations of so many young people today, is they work these jobs just to earn a wage, their wages, but they just do this job and they don't see the fruits. They don't see any real world impact from what they're doing. They're slaving away, but they don't get the satisfaction of seeing the catharsis of seeing the end result. And I think that's something that's been it's a bit lost in our times today. We're looking at jobs and work and labor through such a materialist lens of that you just have to work to make money, and then that's going to be your satisfaction. You can use that money to buy whatever you need to be happy. But that's not the ancient or classic way of looking at work. Your labor should be giving you some type of satisfaction just for the fact of that you were doing it in the first place. And I think that is a very enticing thing to be able to give, especially to young people, and more specifically young men today, is that idea of you might not be earning as much as the guy that's working at the bank or working at some big corporate opportunity, but you are making a difference. Every day you are seeing the difference that you are making. And you can actually, when someone asks you, so what do you do for a living? You can pretty much answer them with, well, where should I start? How much time do you have? You should be excited to be telling people about what you're doing. I mean, that comes down to, there's that classic quote that a lot of people in our spheres always repeat, that idea of hard times create strong men, and then strong men create good times, and good times create weak men, and weak men create bad times again. But I mean, there's another element to that story, and that's the fact that living in good times, when you live in good times, you have the benefit of being able to very easily live a comfortable life. But when you live in hard times, you have the benefits of, you have the opportunity to live a great life, much more than you would have had when you were living in good times. I think that's the type of perspective shift that can actually move mountains, if you just give some young people that type of lens to look at the world and the contribution that they can make.
Well, I also think you can, when making this sell to a young person, you can rip a page from Uncle Ted, and you can say that rather than doing a surrogate activity, you can do something that actually matters, right?
And that's, well, and not only that, Black Horse, but that, and this is, I think, what many of us are trying to do. I mean, I'm almost 60 now, right? And so part of me, you sort of wish, like, oh my word, I wish that I had been in my 20s when all of this was happening. I could just go. But one of the things, though, I think that you want to have that sense when you're building something, is that you're part of a larger project. And that's, I think, one of the things that is very clear in a place like South Africa and Aranya. People there know what they're building, and they know what they're working toward. And I think that's really one of the things that is not immediately apparent to our people. And I think, part of what my sense of this
does a pretty good job articulating. I mean,
yes,
like one of the things that I think about New Founding, there's two real things that distinguish it from the Parallelism project that Cryptos, you and I are a little bit closer to here.
That's right.
In Southern Ontario. The first is that it's articulated rather than inexplicit. So New Founding, has a way better media game than we do. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's exactly it.
Everybody involved in it knows that they're fighting for, like, an American restoration, basically, and an American restoration that has its reestablishment as a Christian nation at the core of the message. The other thing that distinguishes it from the project we're engaged in, which I think is interesting, is the focus on the VC model rather than, our communities are almost entirely focused on the owner-operator model, where, like, every business that sponsors my local Christian school is a business that's owned by a family or by less. It has one or two owners, right? And it's scaled based on how much money they could raise by mortgaging their house at a fundamental level. My business maybe being an exception to that. But the VC model is quite different than that for a whole variety of reasons. And I think it's interesting to see, the way that plays out differently in the US. I also think it's much more sort of, I recently had the experience of going around to a bunch of my clients and having them all tell me how grateful they were that there's a generational transition going on in my business rather than a venture capitalist coming in, because there's the broad perception in a place like Canada is that venture capitalist is synonymous with short-term vision. So it's interesting that New Founding is distinguishing itself in a number of ways there.
Well, and I think that I'll note two things. We didn't launch a venture capital fund for a few years. I think owner-operator businesses will actually be the vast majority of the movement as I see it too. The biggest reason we don't have them as the center of what we're doing to some extent is because I just don't see, I don't know that there's an obvious way to scale something that touches the owner-operator model. So I think that we are working on a project that would be a technology platform that I think would be conducive to that and would actually be designed to support small businesses. I would love to support small businesses. I think it's very, very challenging to build something that can actually meaningfully serve and advance a large number of small businesses. So to some extent, I'm just not convinced that I have something to add to them. I think that I think in a place like Tennessee, where we're doing the Highland Rim project, I think there will be a lot of small businesses. There already are a few owner-operator small businesses that are going to be centerpieces there. So I wouldn't distinguish. I don't know if the shape is as different so much as I think the tip of the spear is venture here. I don't know that the outcome. I don't know that I want the outcome to be a world dominated by venture-backed businesses any more than you would necessarily your people would necessarily want that. But I think there will be a few of them.
But there are also some things that, like you say, Nate, and probably for good reason, in a sense, because it comes back to that whole question of who's in charge and who's accountable. When you have an owner-operator business, the owner's in charge, the owner's accountable, and that creates these sort of natural hierarchies. But there's always things, even if you're creating a network of small communities and you're looking to build a vision to say, put the pieces in place to activate them for when that time comes where you need to organize at scale on short notice or prepare for a crisis, that there are things that are needed that can't be provided necessarily from an owner operator that require venture capital. Well, just that example keeps coming back to my head, like, building small scale power, power companies that can provide power to a community of 10,000 and can be set up locally. Those are not the kind of things necessarily that an owner operator can produce on their own, but require somebody with some outside investment. Those, and there's probably others, a fair number of other ideas. That's just the one that keeps coming back to my mind. But there's things like that just can't be provided by it. So I think there's a real place for something like New Founding, but also to say, hey, we need to start thinking, we need to have a plan. And I think that in some ways, the benefit of putting out a manifesto is just declaring that, hey guys, there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's about time for us to have a plan.
Well, and I'll add one thing about the plan that I think is central, and I think that was actually Blackhorse got a good point there, which is we are consciously articulating a vision. And I think it's interesting. I mean, it took me 3.5 years to do this because I actually temperamentally tend in the direction that I know you can, Cryptos, which is a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty about things. I think there's, and not just sort of personal uncertainty, but sort of appreciating uncertainty in the world, appreciating some of the fundamental contradictions or problems of our entire system, appreciating the risks of too technical of a solution. But I think we have a major problem in America, which is that the right, the conservative movement, has had a vision to some extent imposed on it that has deeply corrupted us. So in many ways, we've been channeled toward things that are fundamentally conservative, with a definition of conservatism that is very conducive to protecting the incumbent regime, or even sort of actively promoting a sort of global liberalism. So in many ways, I think we have a problem where we need to sort of jarringly recalibrate or at least offer a very compelling alternative vision to pull people away from one that is actually very damaging. And that may be a problem in other places. I'm not sure the extent to which that dynamic is true across the Western world.
I don't know if anyone has any. We're getting up to about an hour now, and I know that you're a busy man, Nate, and I really appreciate. And also too, I'm watching the sun going down there, Ernst, and realizing that night is falling on you in South Africa. But I really thank you all for your time, especially you, Nate, and Ernst, especially joining us from South Africa, for coming in, answering the questions, and hopefully this will begin a larger discussion. And again, thank you all to our listeners, and hopefully you've benefited from this conversation.
Thank you.
Well, Cryptos, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to be able to share some insights here from this corner of the dark continent. And Nate, all the best with what you're doing there. Me and my colleague, other Ernst Roots from the Solidarity Movement, we had the opportunity and the pleasure to meet some of your colleagues there from New Founding. Joshua and Santiago there when we were visiting the United States. So that was a very nice conversation, and we'll definitely be in touch.
I'm glad they could meet, and I'm glad we could talk here, and it's fascinating following your project because of the parallels. And thank you for having me on this, Cryptos and Black Horse.
Excellent. And with that, we will bid goodbye.